included staffing numbers, cost, and the cost of doing nothing. If we just stayed in this building, what does that mean? And we went over some of that information, but we're going to talk about it again today. And we also included in your packet a memo that hopefully addresses some of those questions that we heard. And again, we're going to talk about it today to see if you have any follow-up questions. In addition to talking about some of the cost and some of the issues we heard last time, we really want to focus today on the implementation. You heard a little bit about the draft master plan at the last meeting. We're going to talk about some options, some implementation options for that, pros, cons, and hear feedback, questions that you all have, and give you an opportunity to discuss those options as well. So we have three presenters today. First up is Billy Jackson. Billy is our Assistant Director of Engineering Services. Billy's responsible for building maintenance of all our facilities. So he's going to talk a little bit more about the cost of maintaining this building, get into some of the lease issues and some of the other things that we know are on the horizon. Ken Bowers will be next. Ken's going to talk about opportunities for the new Civic campus and just share some thoughts and get some feedback. And then the heavy lift will be by Joe Michael. Joe is our Senior Urban Designer in the Urban Design Center. Joe joined us 2 years ago from New York, and has really worked closely looking at those options, pros and cons and costs, and he will be presenting that. And then I'll take over at the end and go through next steps and get feedback from council. So with that, I'll turn it over to Billy.
Good morning. So what we'd like to do is start with by giving you some context of our current facilities and some of the challenges we face today. So this is a map showing all the buildings we occupy in the downtown. The City Hall, known as Raleigh Municipal Building, is Site 1 just across from Nash Square. We also go beyond Nash Square into our warehouse district to the west, Fayetteville Street to the east, and City Plaza to the south. So in 1983, the population was 147,000. There were 64 square miles. I just got out of high school, so I can remember that pretty well. The city staff had just moved into the Avery C. Upchurch Governmental Complex. It was a brand new facility that was built, and we consolidated all staff into that one campus, or that one building. So moving forward to 2018, 25 years later, the population has more than tripled. The square miles have more than doubled. We've added additional facilities to deal with some of our growth and some of the space needs that we face right now. And having staff work out of 6 locations has created some significant operational challenges that we face every day. So some of those challenges are security, having multiple entrances into a building. So when you think about some of these buildings and you think about multiple entrances, you got to think about the area they were built in, what they were designed intent for, and those things. An example is the municipal building was designed to have quick interaction with our general public, so we do have multiple locations to enter. Back in the day, you come in on 3rd floor, you went straight into planning. 1st floor, straight into HR or paying parking or finance. So it was designed with that intent. Upstairs, 1 floor was our city council chambers and our city council. So, you know, when you think about entrances, that's what the intent was back in the day when these buildings were built. Unsecured parking was something that we face now. And also lack of perimeter security are things we face now. Again, keep in mind when these buildings were built, these things were not issues that people dealt with. The lack of screening, when we look at the age of these facilities, that, you know, some of the houses back in the day when some of these built, they left their houses unlocked. So keep that in mind. And some of the inconsistencies we face amongst our different buildings, excuse me, particularly ones that are owned versus leased. So when you start talking about infrastructure costs and some of the things we face, all of our facilities, whether it's a city-owned facility or a leased facility, we have to have communication, servers, fiber optics, networks. So when we're leasing facilities, we still have to put this infrastructure in to make sure we address those needs and we can communicate. Building systems, we've got fire systems, access systems, and emergency generation systems. Some buildings have backup generation, some do not. Most of our lease facilities have none of these types of systems in them because of the age of some of the facilities we lease. The maintenance and operation costs, you'll see that as facilities age and as we spread out, it just costs more money. So when we talk about things, we talk about duplications of services. As I said, we're at 6 different locations, so that's 6 different facilities that we either depend on security or we have security in those buildings. We have people receiving people or guiding people. Some of the buildings all have very unique layouts, and when you retrofit or fit up buildings, those unique layouts make it complicated and expensive. You don't have things that are consistent. And then also the infrastructure costs for fitting up some of these buildings. Older buildings cost quite a bit more. When you think of even 1983 when this building was built, computers were just getting started. It was not built. The primary form of communication was a telephone. On the desk you would have a phone, an ad machine, and a Rolodex, and that was about it. Today there's a lot more cabling and infrastructure, so these older buildings, that infrastructure costs considerably a lot of money. The other thing that sometimes gets left out is churn. And when I say churn, that is when you relocate or move staff around. It creates what we call churn in my side of the operation. And that is very disruptive both to the staff, but more so to the citizens. It becomes very confusing. We're moving people around because we're growing, and that comes at a high cost. So every time we move, that comes at a very significant cost. The other thing is when we talk about ADA, and when we get to the age of some of these facilities, ADA was not even available or conceived at the time when most of these buildings were built, in customer service. And we're all about inclusion. And so when we start looking about where we're at and ADA and some of those things, some of these buildings are not very welcoming because of the way they were designed. It was not the design intent to meet some of the ADA requirements. Also, when you've got lease facilities, I've got 2 lease facilities that have no ADA compliance whatsoever in them. We've got one that does, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it makes a big difference from an ADA standpoint in dealing with our customer service. When you've got locations, 9 different locations across 3 buildings, people with disabilities, that's a large challenge. It is a very large challenge. And dealing with public, we all have seen meetings where we've been spilling out into our lobbies and we've got overflow on 3rd. You know, in 1983 when this building was built, you walked in our chambers and you said, wow, this is a big place. But 25 years later, we have grown dramatically. And so space and using meeting space is a huge challenge, both in lease space and or city-owned facilities, which that really creates a lot of fragmentation, a lot of confusion. If you've got a citizen coming and they come to the RMD building or Rod Municipal building and they need a permit, then they've got to go down to One Exchange Plaza. Or if they need to talk to Larry Jarvis, and then they got to go to One City Plaza. And if they have to come back to the Urban Design Center, they come back to the Briggs building. You know, we are very fragmented in the way we are and the way we serve our customers. Access, you know, public parking, transportation. We talk of these things. These are high topics that we deal with on a daily basis. Y'all deal with them at the table constantly. And equality, social equality. You know, when you start looking at building placement and parking and adjacencies, all these things matter. And so when you try to lease a space that's got parking with it, the costs go up. And all of these things start adding up and the costs really start ballooning. So we just talked about a little bit about being fragmented, security, infrastructure, the use of our spaces, ADA customer services, all the different things that we really need to deal with. And when we're dealing with own versus lease, there is a big challenge there. When we own it, we plan for it, we spend the money for it. When we lease, we either get the things we need by increased rent because they're going to have a return on their investment. So lease versus own helps us and it creates challenges for us to deal with those kind of things. So these are some of our city buildings that we currently own. I tend to think of things, you know, with years. So when I look at, I've already said Ryan Municipal Building, I graduated high school in 82, so 83 is when we look at it. But then I look at our 110 building, and I was not even born when it was built. When I look at the Dillon building, I was 1 year old at the time, so I relate it to me. But what you see is that our facilities have got a lot of age. And the one thing I want to point out to you about these facilities is the average age of our facilities. It's about 45 years. And a lot of these buildings were not designed for the intent we're using, which then that in turn drives up costs. I've already talked about two of our lease facilities that we have, the Briggs building and professional building. Very older, much older facilities. They do not have any ADA compliancy with them. And when we're negotiating leases, based on some of the negotiations we have, there's not a lot of intent to bring these buildings into compliancy. Now, the One City Plaza building, this is a building we're leasing now, and it does have ADA. It is easy to retrofit. However, in working with lease negotiation recently, the cost per square foot is $29.95 a square foot is today's rate for square footage rent, and they want a 3% escalator, so that comes at a really high cost.
How long have we been leasing these buildings?
Oh, I'd have to look, Mr. Branch, but like the One City Plaza building, about 1.5 years, 2 years. But what we do and the way we deal with leases, as the demand comes up and as it drives us, we hit tipping points and we have to start looking leasing. So, but we've been leasing now for 8 to 10 years, I would guess, because we've outgrown our facilities for many years. And so we've been in leases for quite a while. So when we talk about required maintenance, aging facilities require all kinds of maintenance. An example is like replacing your roof or your HVAC system on your house. The parking deck at Raleigh Municipal Building is one of the oldest in the downtown. And the Raleigh Municipal Building will reach its life expectancy. It's about a 50-year life. And the One Exchange Plaza building will reach his just a few years later. It's a couple of years newer. So when we talk about costs and required maintenance, there's a number of things we have to deal with. And on the right is a list of all the things that we're going to have to look at from a cost perspective. These costs are things we have to do if we keep going down the course we're going. These are things that we have to address. Security is a thing that we really need to spend some money on. ADA, we just talked about some of that. We are working with updating our ADA transition plan now, and to do and meet the needs and continue to evolve to meet those needs, there's a cost with it. Demoing the parking deck, eventually we're going to have to demo it and replace it. And then system upgrades and things at Municipal Building and One Exchange Plaza that extend their life, there are significant dollars with that. And so to drive down in or dive a little deeper, a lot of those costs are going to be system costs. When you get into them, they're not like total facelifts, although with the monies we have, we can do some of that. But a lot of them are mechanical systems, life safety systems like emergency generators and elevators and electrical systems. The electrical system in this building, and electrical is the background I have, the computers that were added create harmonics, and that creates problems on our neutral loads. The systems were not designed to deal with computers in this building, and so addressing, and these older buildings, they're just not designed for some of these things. So, you know, when we reach our 50th year in this building, we're going to have to spend significant dollars upgrading some of these things. The envelope and the window glazing, it's just like any house. You have to maintain them to keep occupying them. The thing about it is when we finish spending this money on all these facilities, we have exactly what we have today, and we'll have to continue leasing and doing other things. So fiscal responsibility. You know, when we really take a look at that, in operations, you can either be proactive or reactive. As an operational manager, I like to have a short-term and a long-term game plan. Lease costs are going to continue to increase. Our older buildings, they're going to need extensive work, and fragmented campuses, they create lots of inefficiencies. So when we really think about it, we really need to plan and get a game plan, because like I said, you can either be proactive and create the plan, or you can be reactive. Either way, there's dollars associated with either direction you go in. So what I've tried to do is quickly lay out a few things about where we're at today, some of the things that we're facing, and explain a few of these costs associated with these facilities.
Maybe we can pause there before we get into Ken's area, see if there's any questions. And again, some of this was from the questions that council had last time about more specifics on cost, security issues. So Billy's shared those thoughts, but if you have any questions, happy to answer.
Okay.
So far, so good, Billy.
Yes, sir, thank you.
So I'm just going to make some brief remarks. I'd like to start by noting for the record that I was not born at the time the Dillon building was built. I was born the year after.
Oh, so we're close.
The Dillon building was built. Just as by way of segueing to the next phase, this is a major project that we're contemplating on a very prominent piece of property, and I just wanted to put it a little bit in context. Maybe once in a generation, most cities get an opportunity to put a major landmark on the city skyline. Look at a structure like the Performing Arts Center with this neoclassical facade. And I remember when that was when it was extended and glassed in to create a reception area, and the dividends that the city has gotten from these investments in major public buildings like that. We have had 3 opportunities in a relatively short period of time. The Convention Center, which opened in 2007 or 8, a beautiful building compared to the Civic Center, replaced, light area open, lots of glass, and then yes, its primary function is to host out-of-town conventions, but we have all sorts of city events. It's a place that's very welcoming for the public. It has public plazas. It's been a great anchor for the south end of downtown. And then there's Raleigh Union Station, which we just celebrated the grand opening of it a couple weeks ago. And yes, it's a train station, but it's more than a train station. It has a beautiful plaza in front of it that's anchoring the end of Martin Street, and it's got a wonderful atrium, again, full of glass, full of light, welcoming space for the public to come, whether you're there to catch a train or just to hang out or to enjoy the public spaces. And now we have the third opportunity, which is the popular civic campus of campus. An incredibly important piece of property, sitting on the north side of one of the 2 historic squares that are still in their original intended use from the original 4 that were platted in the William Christmas plan. And this is a great opportunity to be thinking about what is the future of this block, this important piece of property. And the master planning process that we've gone through, and we presented this in an earlier work session for the affirmation of council, has really tried to encapsulate this in 7 guiding principles. And I won't go through all of this, but a key part of it is obviously integration. What are the key things that need to be co-located so that not only are we welcoming to the public, but as an organization, we are functioning at peak efficiency, and that the pollination that occurs in a workplace between people who work together in proximity is occurring instead of them being fractured among multiple locations. Security, is an extremely important thing. None of our facilities today have really been designed with that in mind. The world has changed, and we need to make that a key priority. We want a sustainable building. This is something that's been in all of our recent buildings. All of our recent buildings have gotten LEED Silver or better. It's got to be flexible to adapt with changing times, in the same way that this building is now being used in a way very different than its designers originally intended, because buildings last a long time. This building has to be flexible and adaptable over time. Cost consciousness is the key of it. We want a good facility. Our employees deserve a good facility. The public demands a good facility in terms of having a place to interact with us in our meeting spaces, our meeting rooms, the council chambers, etc. But it has to be delivered at a reasonable cost, and that's why we look so hard at what are the alternatives, including our current trajectory versus this. And I'd just like to end on the idea that it should be not a sterile government campus, but a place that incorporates a mix of activities and invites the public in a very meaningful way.
So I'm just going to walk you through a few images from the last presentation we've seen with regards to the master plan. So our site is at the edge of several distinct neighborhoods: Hillsborough Street to the north, Fayetteville Street to the east, the Warehouse District to the west. So being at the edge of a lot of neighborhoods means that we're really centrally located and a perfect place to stitch the areas together with a great civic building. We also want to extend the experience of Nash Square into the sites. The 2 blocks work together to create an incredible park and civic plaza sort of experience. At completion, full development would deliver a mixed-use block with most of the public-facing elements anchored to the south facing Nash Square. The first and second levels are envisioned to be transparent, accessible, and open. This is a place for many customer service locations, council chamber, other public assembly spaces. While the towers above are efficient, effective, modern workspaces for our downtown staff and departments. So this all won't be built at once. We'll need to phase construction in manageable pieces. And so that brings us to our next decision point, which is how do we begin to implement this? So we've developed a master plan, but certainly a decision can be made not to move ahead. And so we're calling this the build versus no build decision. So first we'd like to start with looking a little bit more in detail about what it means if we don't build. So Billy's already talked about the cost of maintaining our current facilities, the work we'll need to prepare for over the next 5 to 15 years. And again, this $80 million projection. And what we want to point out is that $80 million is in today's dollars. And so obviously costs are fluid, but it's likely when work is done in 5 years or in 10 years or in 15 years, that will cost more. The same dollars will cost more.
So can I ask one question real quick on that? That's to maintain current facilities. Does that $80 million include having to expand to lease more space? No.
No, and we'll get to that. This is just facility costs.
What we have now, okay.
So one thing that we haven't talked about, I think this was asked about in the last work session, is what are the opportunities from the loss of taxable real estate? So the assumption is that with the consolidated campus, we would move out of One Exchange Plaza and 310 West Martin and sell those properties. So 310, based on its 2016 assessment, would yield just under $20,000 a year. That's with a 5% inflation rate on commercial properties is a conservative average. So we haven't assumed in these numbers, but it could be a safe assumption that with improvements made to those properties, that assessment will increase, and so the tax revenues to the city would increase. Same with One Exchange Plaza, just under $77,000 per year. If you take that out over a 30-year period, you're looking at the least $5 million in lost revenue. Again, improvements to properties would increase that value. Lastly, Billy talked about the challenges of leasing costs with limited supply downtown as rates continue to rise. So if we look at our downtown staff today, we are currently at just over 1,000 people, plus or minus. We've historically grown at a 1.5 to 2% growth rate. So if you take that out over 5 years, 15 years, and 30 years, at the end of 30 years, we're looking at our slowest growth rate, just over 1,600 staff downtown, at our higher growth rate, just under 2,000 staff downtown. So if we look at the leasing costs associated with adding new staff downtown, after 5 years, we'll have added anywhere from 80 to 110 new employees. That'll take approximately 24,000 to 33,000 square feet. That's a floor or a floor and a half of a new office building, for example. The cumulative cost of that over 5 years, plus continuing our current leases, will mean we'll spend anywhere from $8 to $8.5 million over the next 5 years. Now that assumes that we are starting at $23 a square foot with a 1.5% inflation rate, which that's being very optimistic. We know that we're likely getting in the higher 20s on most space, and historically we've had a 2.3% inflation rate on our leasing. Billy talked about the 3% escalators, which are being asked for a yearly leasing agreement. So if we take that out over 15 years, you can see we'll spend anywhere from 35 to 41 million. Take that over 30 years, that number has grown to 120 to 160 million. And again, it's a pretty optimistic number. So what is the real cost of a no-build option? If we simply add these costs and losses up, we get anywhere from $205 million to $245 million over the next 30 years. But again, you know, we've talked about that $80 million is in today's dollars. It's not in when we will actually be doing that construction cost. The loss of taxable real estate, we're not assuming that improvements will be made to properties, and we just talked about how leasing costs, we're being pretty optimistic on what we can achieve downtown. So if we determine that's not a road we should go down, we need to plan for the future. What does it cost to build? In order to not disrupt current city functions and operations, we've identified the vacant police headquarters as a phase 1 location. R&B and the parking deck can still be used if phase 1 is sited here. Phase 1 can be delivered by 2023 or 2024, which is a fairly conservative schedule. We've talked about the public spaces and kind of those 2 levels at the ground level. Those are shown in orange. We've also included 2 levels of underground parking, which are shown in gray. The departmental office space, shown in blue, is where we can develop options for how much we'd like to build. So 3 options, 20 stories, 17, and 14 stories, all have different implications with respect to their capacity. And we've named them to address that. So above capacity is like a loose fitting sweater, at capacity is like a tighter fitting sweater, and below capacity might be like a sweater vest, right? And so with size comes cost, but it's important to remember when we discuss cost, we're in a master plan phase. We don't have a building design where you would perform cost estimates of each phase of the project. So we're using benchmark data to get projected estimates. So if we talk about the first option, the 20-story option, this is the max we can build by zoning. This is pretty much the largest building you could fit on that site, 420,000 square feet, 1,400 people of capacity, and that gives us anywhere of 9 to 14 years in this building. And this is assuming that we're consolidating everyone from our downtown staff into this one building. We're not using other facilities. The cost of that, an estimated cost, is approximately $190 million. But what we want to look at as well is what would the effective rent be over a 30-year period to buy a building versus leasing. We just talked about leasing. We're getting into $30 a square foot in downtown for new space. So if we were to take that $190 million, apply it over 30 years, it ends up being $15, just over $15 a square foot that you're paying for. Of course, the building will last longer than 30 years, it'll go 50 years. So that number gets more efficient the longer we're in the building. Option 2, it's a smaller building, it fits fewer people, as you can see here. But the capacity that we have based on our growth rate, we will fill up the building anywhere from 1 to 5 years, give or take, depending on how fast we grow. Again, a smaller building costs less, $165 million approximately. And again, that effective rent, because we're reducing the number of efficient office floors that we'd be building, it's getting a little bit higher. It's still a really good number compared to paying $30 a square foot in rent. And then lastly, the below capacity option. So this is the smallest building we've considered, but we would be at a deficit on day 1. And so we'll look into what those options are for how we would deal with that. We're looking at this as approximately 140 million square foot building, and you can see the impact to an effective rent. So the phasing, the implications for how much you build on day 1 has implications for your phasing and for the second half of the site, what that means for R&B and how you would use it. So again, 20-story building, what does that mean? It means we can consolidate out of all the buildings that we currently own, all the buildings that we currently lease, and all new leases that we would probably take on over the next 5 to 6 years. It would give us 9 to 14 years of capacity from the day we would move in, which is 5 to 6 years from today. The deck, the municipal deck, plus the new parking, we would meet our parking requirements, and we would use all the floors available to us by zoning. What does that mean for R&B? It means it can be entirely vacated. It will reach its end of life in approximately 10 years after phase 1 is completed. And so at that point, we need to make a decision. Do we reinvest in R&B? and give R&B another 50 years of life. If that's the case, then phase one plus R&B gives the capacity 20 to 30 years on site. That's how long we would have before we would outgrow the site. If we were to build another tower in its place, we would have capacity on the site for anywhere from 45 to just over 60 years. But the main point in this is that there's some flexibility for what you want to do with R&B, if you want to have a temporary use for it, when you would want to fund phase two. There's more time because that's built into the capacity for phase one. 17-story building.
If we could stop on option one, that went through those pros and cons and costs and see if there are any questions before we go to option two.
You know, I appreciate your facts and figures. I believe you're taking the conservative approach, which I appreciate, because actually the rents in some of these new buildings that I'm hearing about is already north of $30 a foot. And also, you figured 300 square feet per employee, and a lot of big folks in the private sector are at 400 square feet per person. So that's conservative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we looked at that number of the square feet per person, and if we could even tighten it up more than that, we realized that wouldn't really be feasible. So, but we are looking at becoming more efficient overall. Okay, so we'll keep going. So the 17-story option, same deal. We can consolidate into this building day one, but we talked about how it's giving us less capacity for growth. So what does that mean for R&B? Again, it can be entirely vacated, but now the capacity on the site is a little bit less if we decide to reuse it. And the capacity on the site is, again, a little bit less if we decide to go with a second building. Again, it's still taking us around 50 years. So the key point here is that we would have less time to decide what to do with R&B, but there could be other options. They could have a temporary use in the near term before our phase two decision is made. We could, again, lease space in order to handle growth before dealing with phase two. But it just is that implication of we would need to make that decision of how we address that a little bit sooner.
And what's that timeframe? You said it's less.
It's anywhere from 1 to 4 years, 1 to 4 to 5 years, depending on how fast we grow.
That may be stretched out a little longer, again, depending on how fast we grow, how many employees are added, so.
And so lastly, the below capacity option. So because we're at a deficit, we would have to explore some other options for how to deal with our growth. So again, we have to think about what's the goal of this. If it's to consolidate all of our staff on the municipal block, then that means we have to keep using R&B, if that's the goal, to have everyone here. So we could vacate all of our buildings except R&B, but in a way, we're kind of committing them to R&B long-term, because it's really hard to, you would have to think about moving all the employees here to another place temporarily if you're gonna redevelop this site later. That limits the site capacity to approximately 9 to 14 years, and then we would need to think about that the additional cost to renovate R&B is, you're looking at $40 million, because you would do the systems upgrade. You would probably then want to enhance that with a little bit more of a facelift to the building. If the goal is to maintain flexibility for this site and to not use R&B, then we could vacate out of all of our owned property, but we would need to keep leasing space in the near term until phase two would come online. So it would have additional leasing costs in addition to the building costs. So just find where I am. So how we approach, so when we talk about the build option, essentially what we're talking about is a phase one option. And with that phase one decision, how much we build is a decision point which has cost implications, but also capacity implications based on our projected growth. And longer term, how that decision influences our approach to R&B and phase two. So with the goal of a developed mixed-use block, we've taken the approach that an entire City of Raleigh funded and developed project is not really realistic or feasible, and that we want to leverage partnerships in order to get the best result. we've looked at the southern portion of the site as where the city would own and develop phase 1 and 2, which can provide a 50-year longer civic campus. The northern half of the site presents an opportunity not only to bring a mix of programs to development, but also a way for the city to generate revenue from the value of the land, most likely in the form of a ground lease, but there are some other options there as well. Our own buildings also have the potential to generate revenue. Building for growth means there will be available space, office space, until we're ready to move into it. Though we might need phase 2 50 to 10 years, or I'm sorry, we might need phase 2 5 to 10 years after phase 1 is done. We wouldn't fill it completely for another 30 to 40. So there's an opportunity to recoup some of that cost by leasing space back out. And that's a complicated discussion we won't get into here, but there's that opportunity out there. So where are our funding sources coming from for this project? The project estimated $38 million from asset sales, which you can see on the site, some of which have already been sold. OEP and 310 Martin were given an estimate of about $18.5 million together. Though in 5 to 6 years, when we would sell those properties, these numbers could likely be higher for those two. The $38 million plus $127 million in debt capacity is how the $165 million placeholder was generated. There will also be some avoided costs by not paying leases in the future. So over the next 15 years, there would be an opportunity to think about how to potentially reuse some of these monies which we're not going to be spending in the future. So it's not that this money exists right now by day one, but it will be avoided cost over time. So if we do nothing and maintain our status quo, we're projected to spend well over $200 million over the next 30 years, and this figure will increase over time. And as we've talked about, that 205 and 245 is a pretty conservative and optimistic estimate. Phase 1, which would be a 50-year project, has a one-time cost estimated between $140 million to $190 million, depending on how much we want to build. So that's a lot of information we just threw at you. But if we want to talk what our first steps would be, is that we would look for a direction on phase 1. We're not showing the below capacity option, as staff believes it's not a long-term viable option and creates additional complications to the project. And so you're receiving a handout that summarizes the pros and cons for options 1 and 2 shown here. And so with that, I'll pass it back over to Joe to talk about next steps.
Joe, thank you. So Mayor and Council, Joe did a great job. He focused primarily on 3 options. You could really add that do nothing as a option number 4 if the committee wishes to consider that. As Joe mentioned, we propose the committee focus on the above capacity and at capacity options. As far as next steps, it's been assigned to the committee. The committee can recommend one of those options out. We would suggest this go back to a council work session. Obviously a significant project, a lot of interest from the entire council. So whatever the committee may recommend, rather than having that on a council agenda, we would suggest that that recommendation go to a full work session, and that the team do this presentation or a similar presentation to make sure all the council is aware. That arrow that Joe has really could go down into the council action as well. That's really the first step, is to direct staff on which option the council wishes to pursue, whether it's the above capacity or at capacity or something else. We'll then take that information, go back to SOM. SOM has done a lot of work on the master plan, but they need that direction from council in order to finalize the master plan. So when you get into council action, you see 2, 3, and 4 once council gives us that direction on an implementation strategy, SOM would finalize the plan, we would bring that back to council for approval. We would also ask that you direct staff to put together an engagement plan that we would bring back to council for approval. Obviously, this is important to the whole community, and we want to make sure we're getting engagement from citizens and stakeholders. And then the final step is council authorize staff to proceed with an RFP for design services. So that really lays out the next steps. We're happy to answer any questions you may have on the presentation or any other issues that you may have on your mind.
What's the maximum debt capacity without raising taxes?
It's 100.
165, well, 127.
Well, I saw
127.
127, but is that the max?
That's pretty much the max. Now, we can analyze that again, but that is the max number without increasing taxes at this point.
Well, thanks, Carol, and everybody for doing all this. It's a lot of work and it does definitely help, put a lot of things out there, especially the cost of doing nothing, which is pretty overwhelming. Even more than option one, and I don't know how the committee feels. I would agree with you for removing option 3. I just don't see the wisdom of building something that doesn't even meet our needs, much less in the future. So
Yeah, so I think the first thing you said, Billy, was that you need to make the decision whether to build or not build, and I certainly think, or do nothing, and, I definitely feel that we need to build a new facility here. This building is very tired. It served a good purpose, it's lasted a pretty long time, but it's been so many changes in technology, and for a lot of the reasons y'all have mentioned, it's, to retrofit this building, you would be putting Band-Aids on it, in my opinion. And, as far as option, I agree, Mayor, option 3 is, in my opinion, something we shouldn't even consider, because in being in the building business for 40 years, I've never, ever built a building for someone and they came back and said, I wish I would have built it smaller. They just, because you need more space and you're gonna grow, the city's gonna grow. And also, great cities have great city halls, and we don't have one. And I'm not talking about building a monument, I'm thinking of something that's practical, that the taxpayers wouldn't be overly burdened by, by trying to build a monument, but very functional, by putting it all together, by bringing, just the, the fact that it would, like you said, sending folks all over town to do business with the city is really not a good thing to do. So I think in this day and age, so, like to hear the rest of you, but I mean, that's kind of my feelings on it.
And back to what Ken was talking about, when he talked about, building the convention center and the Union Station. It's not, to me, it was not just the building and the statement that we made as a city, how we felt about design and all those things, but look at what each of those did for the economy and the economic, whatever, building that went on. I mean, the convention center was a game changer for downtown, and just when we started planning Union Station is what brought Citrix in, and we had the Dillon, so it's more than just, we know we need it. We know we'll be more efficient with everybody in the same place, but I think it is important what it says about it and how we certainly had enough discussions about what needs to face our public squares and how we activate those, and I appreciate you working that, taking that into consideration too. I know that there's, well,
Well, I was just gonna say, the reason why I asked about the debt capacity, because I was just doing the math, and this building, we outpaced it in 25 years. If we are talking about the 20-story option, we're saying in 10 years we'll outgrow it on our current growth rate, which means we'll have to start working on the second phase, second building, in order to get to 30 years. And so we're saying 2 buildings roughly in 40 years, we're gonna outgrow if we keep our same projected growth rate. We are the city, we control our own zoning. So that's, when I say debt capacity without raising taxes, is 20 stories. Based on the math, I like option 2, because it falls right in line with where our current debt capacity. As far as looking at future growth, 3 extra stories, $15 extra million for those 3 stories, I'm just trying to look at other options, as far as height and where we are as far as building a
Should we
second
go higher,
building.
you mean?
Yeah, should we go higher?
Well, the county facility overbuilt, and they lease, I think, the top couple stories in the building until they have the ability to build those up. I think that even if you do the option 2 at $165 million, it's less, but then we still have the decision where we have to start putting money into this building.
Right.
Or you build the phase 1 larger, which gives you a longer time, and you then could have the option of building a second tower, as opposed to having to start putting money into this building right away.
So those are just some of the things I'm thinking about as I'm sitting here is, 25 years. We're having to build 2 buildings in 25 years, so we're really talking over, $300 million.
I think the second building would hold us for much longer than 25 years. I mean, I think the point of building the second tower would be to be able to lease it.
Right.
And have income and then grow into it.
I second everything.
Did you hear me?
I did hear all of it. It was shocking. I really appreciate what y'all have laid out in front of us. I lean towards option number 1. I understand that kind of upfront cost concerns, but I think overall it feels a lot more economically conservative in a lot of ways, even though it's just projected longer. So that's where I'm leaning.
I mean, to build the first building a little larger, we know by the time we get around to building the second building, it's gonna cost a lot more. So are you better to build the first building a little larger and have the capacity to grow into it?
Especially where you can lease out some of the space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the county building is how many stories?
I've forgotten, but somebody was telling me.
Yeah, it's maybe 8 or 9, somewhere around there, but again, it's got huge floor floors
Yeah,
because
it
of
has built very differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, big floor plate.
Yeah.
Very tall.
Yeah, we don't have the budget the county has.
One thing for the conversation of the 190 for option 1 versus 165 for option 2. Again, nothing's been designed,
Yeah,
nothing's
right.
been done, so those are estimates. And if council directed us for option 1, Mr. Branch, well, you're talking about debt capacity and other revenues or cost changes, how would we afford that? We would need to do some analysis. Second thing that will help us is designing this thing and putting out to bid, or are we talking, 190, 195, 185, same on the 165. So I just want everyone to understand these are just preliminary figures. And if council directs on that option 1, staff needs to do some more evaluation.
It sounds like we are leaning toward option 1.
Yes.
Any motion on that?
I'll make a motion.
Okay.
And I guess that's the recommendation, to still take this to a full.
But we're still taking it to the work
So,
session.
that's right, so
Yeah.
you've got an option here. You can select either option 1 or 2 as your recommendation, like you do with other issues that come in front of the committee, and then that's reported to council. And again, we recommend a work session where we can do a similar presentation. Or if you like, you could take both options to the full council.
I'd like, my motion's for option one.
Okay. And did you second that?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So we'll still take all of this to a work session
Yes, ma'am.
with the recommendation that this committee looked at it and.
Recommended
after
option
seeing what
one.
Felt like option one was better, that.
Yes, for some of the reasons you discussed and we presented. So we will work to schedule that. Your work session schedule is very busy.
After a break.
Excuse me?
After a summer break.
After the break.
Whatever.
So we will evaluate that, but it may have to
Probably only have a couple
occur.
more, so it's probably right.
It may have to occur in August. So we'll evaluate that and make sure. Is there any other information that you would like us to include or that would be helpful in the next meeting?
No, and I don't think we need to get into numbers, but I think part of, it's not our decision because we really are deciding on option 1 and 2, but I just want everybody to remember that we still have the other half of the block.
Right.
With the ability to do some sort of a partnership with, will also provide income in the future, so it's not, you know.
So that's a good point, and we're focused on what Joe said is phase 1 going into phase 2, the other tower, but you're right, at phase 3, looking at public-private partnerships, a lot of opportunities, but the immediate, the phase 1 is what we're going to discuss.
Question, the parking deck, would that be part of phase 1?
So right now, we've assumed that you would put the parking deck plus a new underground deck and then those
That's
two.
the orange.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Those two together, the balance of those two provide our necessary zoning required parking. At some point, this deck will need to be replaced, and there will have to be kind of a discussion of how we deal with that loss of parking in that period while it's being replaced. Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you, and I'd like to thank the team too behind this. A lot of folks have worked on this and spent a lot of time, so appreciate everybody's effort and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.